Greetings, fellow ghouls, and thanks for stopping by on this stormy evening. Yes, I'm still a prisoner here at Litchfield Asylum, and I can feel myself growing crazier by the day. Still, none of these abominable attendants have spoken to me. They just keep me locked up and occasionally let me out into the common area. It is nice to be out of the straitjacket, even if just for a moment. Thanks for coming to check on me. I suppose the least I can do is read you a true scary story. Would you like to hear one? That's not easy to do in here, but try and get comfortable, and I'll tell you the tale of the Static Whisper. When I was in the 5th grade, a huge hurricane tore through my small town. The week before, during school, we'd all been hearing rumors that this massive storm named Hurricane Isabel was going to absolutely pummel us that coming Friday. We'd had plenty of snow days before, but with news about Isabel's destructive potential all over the TV, my friends and I wondered if it might be possible to have a hurricane day. Our science teacher, Mr. Hatch, assured us that the whole thing was overblown by the media, that the storm would dissipate, and that, in his 30 years of teaching, there had never been a hurricane day. Well, Friday came, and Mr. Hatch was forced to eat his words. I woke up that morning to the sound of a news report on TV, a list of school closures echoing down the hall from my parents' room. I got up and watched from their doorway as the ticker scrolled at the bottom of the screen. Not just a 1 or 2 hour delay, it was officially the whole day off. A bit like a dog chasing a car, I then realized that I hadn't quite thought this all through. When there's a snow day, you can go outside, meet up with friends, go sledding, etc., but my newly realized hurricane day wasn't going to offer the same fun. I ran over to the window and peeled back the curtain to be greeted by a dark gray sky, torrential rain, and gale-force winds. The rain was coming down in sheets, spraying the driveway in the front of my house like a pressure washer. Skinny trees bent at 45-degree angles, and larger ones rocked back and forth as if churning on the high seas. So, as great as it was to have school canceled, now all I could do was sit and watch as Hurricane Isabel thrashed my neighborhood. Speaking of the trees, my house was in a quiet neighborhood with tons of them. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere, and we were surrounded on all sides by big old oaks, elms. There was even a weeping willow in the front yard. While I quite enjoyed having so much nature around, this meant that strong winds would occasionally bring down some of these botanical behemoths, messing with our power lines and leaving us in the dark. All through my childhood, it seemed as though branches were constantly snapping off and knocking power lines onto the street. And so, as I watched from the window that morning, I knew we'd lose power any minute. And there it went. Outside, I heard the low hum of a transformer. The TV in my parents' room fell silent. The news anchor cut off mid-sentence, as if Isabel herself had interrupted him in conversation. And that was that. The power was gone. One of those big old trees had probably toppled somewhere, and with the weather outside being so intense, it was going to be a while before anyone fixed it. That meant no TV, no PS2, no computer, no nothing. Outside was off the table, and inside wasn't looking too much better. Luckily, my parents had prepared a bit for the storm. After all, the news had been hyping it up all week. We had plenty of food and water in the pantry, and the oven, connected to the gas line, was still working. My parents made a big breakfast for a bit of fun, and then my dad went to grab something else that he had gotten in preparation for the storm. It was something I had never seen before, a crank radio. It was a gray, boxy thing, about the size of a VHS tape. It looked more or less like a regular radio, with a dial for tuning and a speaker, but true to its name, there was a plastic crank that folded out on the right side. A bit of elbow grease could power the radio for a good little while, about a minute or two if I remember correctly, allowing us to get news updates about the hurricane without any power whatsoever. My dad showed me how it worked, and we scanned the frequencies until we found some kind of news report. I spent the rest of the day doing a bit of reading and drawing, just generally trying to keep myself entertained as Hurricane Isabel raged on outside. Sometime in the late afternoon, I was sitting in my room, drawing, when I heard this incredible cracking sound coming from outside. Even with all my windows closed in the rain, it was so loud that it made me jump. I sprang up from my bed and ran to the window to see what was happening. The window in my room looked out onto the backyard. The storm outside seemed just as strong as it had been earlier, still bending the old trees to awkward angles as it sent sheets of rain ripping through them. My eyes locked onto one of the trees, the source of the cracking sound. Oh no. Timber. Crack. Crack. More loud explosions of sound as the tree bent further and further, eventually toppling completely and landing with an earth-shaking thud in the backyard. Luckily, our backyard was big enough that it missed the house, but I could easily imagine the destruction that would have ensued if it hadn't. I heard my parents freak out from the other room as they heard the thud. "One of the trees in the backyard," I called out. "It fell over." They rushed to the window to see the newly horizontal oak tree. There wasn't much to do about it now except be glad for the fact that it missed the house. Still, it definitely made me feel less safe inside, and I spent the rest of the day worrying that another tree might come crashing through the roof at any moment. The storm continued on into the evening, and so did the lack of power. We still had gas for the stovetop, so we made some tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner. I grabbed a handful of pizza goldfish out of the cupboard and made sure to scatter them in my soup for good measure. After we finished eating, my dad grabbed the radio again and gave it a few good cranks. We found some kind of news channel that was broadcasting weather information and giving updates on the storm. I remember hearing that the Potomac River was 10 feet above flood stage, and that millions of people along the East Coast were without power like us. Wind gusts in our area had been over 85 miles per hour. While good to be aware of, none of these stats were all that comforting, especially not right before going to sleep. We listened for a bit longer and then eventually decided to get ready for bed. That night, I found it almost impossible to fall asleep. As I said earlier, my room was on the second floor and looked out onto the backyard, which was full of trees. As I lay there wide awake in my bed, I could hear the sound of the wind howling outside, and I imagined what the trees all around me must have looked like, literally bending at the will of the hurricane and straining their shallow roots. The reports of casualties on the crank radio echoed in my mind. I pictured the trees all tilting, a little more, then a little more, then finally enough to crack, rip themselves from the earth and crash through the roof right onto my bed. I replayed the vision of the tree falling earlier over and over in my mind. It was only a matter of time until another one came crashing down, and this one surely wouldn't miss. Yes, there was no way I could sleep up in my room that night. I was far too exposed on the second floor, so close to the roof, with all those windows surrounding me. I made my way back downstairs. The living room was the largest room in the house, and the couch in it was far away from any windows. I figured I could try to sleep there. I threw my pillow onto the old couch and curled up under the blanket. I could still hear the wind howling outside and the rain tapping on the glass, but down here it was all a bit quieter. I lay there for a while, squeezing my eyes shut and doing my best to stop worrying about the storm. I'm not sure how long I spent doing this, but alas, it was to no avail. I sat up on the couch, wondering what I could do to try and make myself sleepy. I looked down at the wooden coffee table next to the couch. On it was the crank radio. I picked it up and gave it a few good cranks. The sound of the news channel softly bubbled up from the onboard speaker. I cranked harder until I could hear it a bit better. I listened for a few minutes as they talked about the hurricane, mentioning how it might be at least a few days before the power came back. I listened for a bit longer until it became clear that they were beginning to repeat themselves and pretty much out of things to say. Still not tired, however, I decided to mess around with the tuning knob on the radio, searching for other stations and seeing what else I could pick up. I remember it was mostly static, and for a while I was just shuffling between different versions of what sounded like white noise. But as I was scrolling through the frequencies, I heard someone whispering. I only heard it for a brief moment as I was cycling through, and I started turning the knob back to the other way to try and find it again. Where had it been? I scrolled back, forth, slower, much like bringing an image into focus on a camera, until I found it. There it was. It was just barely poking through the static, but it was there. A quiet voice. It sounded like a woman's voice, or maybe a high-pitched man's voice, whispering. I couldn't tell if it was full sentences or just staccato words and phrases. Then it began to fade away. I frantically cranked the knob until the volume level returned. However, the sound of the wind and the rain continued to pelt the glass window panes of the living room, and so I pulled the blanket over my head so I could listen to the radio under it, and hopefully hear the strange message a little bit better. Under the cover, the voice was slightly clearer. The words emerged through the static like a ship through the fog. I know you are listening. I can see you. I involuntarily shuddered, came out from under the blanket, and threw the radio across the couch. The voice continued whispering, so I grabbed the device and frantically searched for the off switch in the dark. The voice continued as I fumbled around with the radio, sounding a bit more gravelly now. I'm outside your house. I'm outside your house. Click. I had finally found it. I dropped the radio back onto the couch and ran upstairs without even grabbing my pillow or blanket. My parents had heard the commotion as I ran back upstairs. They woke up and came into my room, asking what I was doing. I told them about the radio and the terrifying voice I'd found mysteriously broadcasting. My dad told me not to worry, and that it was probably just somebody messing around on an unused frequency. They stayed with me for a moment and calmed me down before heading back to bed. Eventually, I fell asleep. That night, I had a strange vision. I remember dreaming of some mysterious figure standing out in the storm, bent at a 45-degree angle like the trees themselves, watching through the window. They were tall and skinny, with long, wiry hair. Their feet were flat on the ground, but the gusts of wind had caused the rest of their body to flail wildly in the storm. They reminded me of those wacky inflatable tube men you see at used car lots. When I woke up the next morning, I vowed never to touch the crank radio again. The storm eventually passed, the power eventually returned, and I eventually went back to school. But even after things were back to normal, I would still find myself daydreaming of that static whisper and the night of the hurricane. Ooh, another twisted tale of terror. Can you imagine someone watching you through the window at night during a hurricane? Now that's what I call the eye of the storm. Well, guess that's all for now, fellow ghouls. Looks like my time is just about up. Okay, I'm going.